Hello everyone, and I hope you are having a very good 2026 so far. Okay, so this is going to be a different video to what I normally do. I'm normally giving extremely deep dives into things involving the Stark family, the Crypt of Winterfell and things like that. So this is a bit more of a reaction to the two huge bits of news we've had in the last week concerning George R.R. Martin. So there's the first episode of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which I've got a few thoughts on. And then there's also this article that came out in The Hollywood Reporter, which was this extremely open and vulnerable interview that has made me think about where we're at with these books. It's made me want to talk a little bit more on something that I think is quite likely to happen within the next couple of years, and I'll get to that. But firstly, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the first episode. What do I think? Well, I was expecting pretty good things because the trailer looks amazing. I went into the first episode expecting something that I certainly didn't get from House of the Dragon, and certainly wasn't evident in the later series of Game of Thrones, and that was a pretty faithful adaptation of the source material. If anything, it's overly true to the text in that you've got Dunk kind of talking through a lot of the things that are written in his thoughts in the novella. I don't think that worked brilliantly in the first episode, and equally, like in some of the interactions he had, you've got things that aren't said in the story which are being said out loud in the episodes, and I think it sounds a bit clunky. I did find the whole thing a little bit slow and ponderous, and on the one hand I don't mind that because it sets this series up as being quite different from the other two shows, and I think that's a good thing because, you know, it's a short story, it's a novella, we've got 6 episodes, so there's only so much plot you're going to get through in the 40 odd minutes of an episode. But I suppose I was expecting it to just kind of come out with a bit more of a bang. Like if you think back to the first House of the Dragon episode, it didn't need to come out as hard as it did, but it kind of made a bit of a statement. Now, with this first episode, if it's making a statement, it's saying something along the lines of, be patient, because we're going to take our time telling the story. It's not going to be massive blockbuster events happening every episode. So this is a story that is very much about its characters. And just to touch on those two characters, I don't think they could have cast Dunk any better. Like, that guy is... He doesn't only appear to be sort of like quite clumsy, very affable, you know, this sort of like lumbering presence, who looked completely ill at ease in his environment, which is something that you didn't really get from the novella too much, but I thought this first episode did brilliantly. In terms of Egg, it's difficult to say because he doesn't get a lot of screen time in this episode, and I sort of found him to be a little bit more of a child than the Egg in the books, which I think makes a bit of sense because throughout all of the Dunk and Egg novellas, he set up Egg as being this kind of oracle of wisdom, which 10-year-old children are not. So I think a few of the lines that are taken directly from the source material, they just didn't land as well as I thought they might, and that kind of goes for a lot of the humour that they were going for as well, and that did worry me a little bit because they're going for something that is, you know, a little bit more light-hearted. And if it's not funny, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Luckily, they've got Daniel Ings, who plays the Laughing Storm. And if anyone watching this hasn't seen a Netflix show called The Gentleman, I really, really recommend you do, because he's unbelievable in that. And it gives you a good idea as to what he's going to do with the character. And yeah, I liked pretty much everything he did in this episode. I'm glad he's in all of the episodes of the series. It might be that I'm being quite picky because the Dunk and Egg stories are my favourite stories in the entire Song of Ice and Fire world. And funnily enough, I've been looking at all the reviews that people have been doing, and everyone's been pretty enthusiastic. They're my thoughts. I'd be interested to know what other people think about that. But yeah, so moving on to the Hollywood Reporter article, and one of the good things about that article, for sure, is the fact that we have this news that Ira Parker has been given, I think they said he's been given 12 unpublished Dunk and Egg novellas, like the outlines for them. I think it was either 10 or 12. So, that coupled with the 3 that we've already got gives you an idea on the longevity of this series. It's going to be on our TV screens for a long time, and we're going to basically grow up with these characters. So that could be quite fun. And then, you've got George R. R. Martin saying that, we like to think that he's not being distracted by these TV shows, because obviously we're very much waiting for The Winds of Winter to come out. But it seems like his dealings with Ira Parker, his enthusiasm for this first series, have kind of reignited his passion for writing a few more Dunk and Egg stories, which I think would be a great thing. We know that one of them is going to be based in Winterfell. I can't wait to see that. And I think he said that he started writing one that will be based in the Riverlands. And that makes me think that it's going to be around the Bracken and Blackwood rivalry, and I'd love to see that. So, even if we have like an initial 5 Dunk and Egg novellas to be playing with for the TV show, that's great. That gives us something tangible to look towards in terms of his writing output, because it does not sound like he's having a particularly fun time. So, on to what he says about The Winds of Winter. So, reading between the lines, it's clear that he's struggling to write at the moment, that he doesn't feel particularly good about either his progress, his prospects for finishing, or I think his relationship with, the fans, which is something I'll talk on in a little bit. And yeah, ultimately, after reading that article, I felt a little bit sad and frustrated, and it didn't leave me feeling particularly optimistic about our prospects of getting a new book within the next few years, or at least it doesn't make me feel optimistic about getting The Winds of Winter in the next few years. And what I mean by that is that I've got a strong suspicion that the next book in the series will be a book that isn't entitled The Winds of Winter. So I'll get to that in a second. But firstly, I'll just touch on where George R. R. Martin's head is at in terms of his relationship with the fans. Honestly, I feel quite bad for the guy, because it does seem like he's taking on the pressures of having not delivered a novel for, 15, 16 years now. But, in that time, you've had 3 TV shows come out about your work, and that has brought a whole new fan base into play. And it feels like this isn't helping him in terms of his progress with writing. It feels like every time he sits down to start work on these things, he's second guessing himself, and he's reading over what he's just written and rewriting it again. And it seems to me like he's been quoting this figure of 1,100 manuscript pages for the best part of 4 or 5 years now. Certainly since his little spurt during COVID. And I think a huge reason for his lack of progress comes from how he interacts with his fans and the pressure that he feels, the demands that seem to be put on him, the constant worries over George R. R. Martin's age, his physical health, like trying to predict how long he's got before he dies. I mean, we're in an unbelievably toxic space here, and it's clearly having an effect on him. It boggles my mind that so many people can't seem to understand why this novel is so difficult to write. This is not just sitting down and writing a book. This is getting inside the head of 20 or so POV characters, exploring their trajectories, and trying to fit that in with all of the other characters and all the other storylines. As someone who does write a bit as someone, you know, who tries to sit down and, you know, develop my own ideas, it is unbelievably difficult to get into that headspace. And when you are in that headspace, you just keep on going, and you keep on going until you stop. And then, you know, you've got to kind of wait for the next bit of inspiration to get you, you know, over the next hurdle. I get the impression that every time he sits down with a POV, he's already thinking about the complexity of what he's having to write. He'll review where he's at so far, he'll rewrite everything, and then, you know, you just get into this situation where you're constantly second guessing yourself. I'm trying to think of other novels, apart from obviously the Lord of the Rings trilogy, that have this level of complexity. And, you know, just for example, it is nothing like sitting down and writing scripts for things like Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. It's kind of like writing an installment for, let's say, the Star Wars saga, but doing it 20 times from 20 different points of view, and then trying to condense it into 1,500 manuscript pages. I mean, I've got an interview here with him in 2018 where he said that, you know, The Winds of Winter is not so much a novel as a dozen novels, each with different protagonists, each having a different cast of supporting players, antagonists, allies and lovers around them, and all of these weaving together against the march of time in an extremely complex fashion. I mean, that's a pretty good summing up of the task ahead of him. When people say that they can't understand how it's taking him so long, I feel like just, you know, don't even bother trying to put yourself into his mindset, because you clearly don't know what you're talking about. And it's not for you to put deadlines on the guy. Like, as far as I'm concerned, if he stops trying to write The Winds of Winter tomorrow, then in all honesty, fair enough. You know, it's frustrating as hell. But if he was to write another Dying of the Light, another Sand Kings, that would be fine with me. And then, you know, maybe continue to do the Duncan Egg novellas. He doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe us 2 more books. And let's face it, it's extremely unlikely that he'll be finishing this saga. But as to The Winds of Winter, and trying to think about when it will come out, I've got a few thoughts about that I don't really see being spoken of too much. The YouTuber Admiral Kurd, he did a great video about 5 or 6 years ago called How the Winds of Winter will fit into the Winds of Winter. And that was a really smart way of looking at the task that George has, I thought. And then a couple of years ago, he wrote, he did a deep dive into trying to predict when the Winds of Winter will be here. I strongly recommend you go watch both of these videos, and I'll leave links to them. But just to paraphrase him ever so slightly, he points to this period of time just after A Storm of Swords was released, when George R. R. Martin was writing the next installment, which at that point was A Dance with Dragons. And what happened then, as we all kind of know, is that he jettisoned this idea of a 5-year gap happening in the timeline, so aging up characters like Jon, Dany, Arya, so that they reach where they should be for the story to progress in the kind of, let's call it the timely fashion that he originally predicted. He decided that he didn't want to leave the current goings on in Westeros, and so he basically made the call to his publishers and said, right, I won't be able to get where I need to at the end of A Dance with Dragons unless I add another volume called A Feast for Crows that goes into what's happening on the Iron Islands, goes into what's happening in Dawn, deals with Cersei as a POV character, and, you know, brings in a few, well, more than a few other characters, which certainly help expand the story, but also add an infinitely more complex web of POV characters into the mix. And what I thought was most interesting in the Admiral Kurd video was when he points out that a very similar thing is happening with the Winds of Winter. So it's not working in the way that George R. R. Martin predicted that George R. R. Martin wants it to work. You know, he's always said, look, I think I'm in with a shot of making this whole story work, you know, in 1,500 manuscript pages, so that by the time A Dream of Spring kicks around, you've got Daenerys in Westeros, you've got things in King's Landing kind of set up, and the White Walkers are just about to invade. And thinking back now on what we expected the Winds of Winter to be, it seems madness to think that he had any realistic ambition of interweaving these 20 point of view characters into one novel, you know, into 1,500 manuscript pages. Like, if there's one thing you can maybe say about George R. R. Martin, it is that he seems to have an infinite capacity for denial. He's obviously quite a stubborn guy, and I liked in the article where he admitted that he's got a huge ego, which he does. You know, he comes across as a lovely guy, but this is someone who's right at the top of their trade. But he's in constant denial about his progress and his ability to do things in the time frames and in the page count that he's given himself. And I personally think we're getting very close to the situation where he admits that to himself and makes peace with it and says to his publishers, look, in order to get to where I need to get to by the end of the Winds of Winter, I'm going to need another volume. And I think that's going to happen in the next couple of years. I really do. He's going to know that there needs to be one book to take care of some areas of Westeros. And then the Winds of Winter will come out at some point afterwards, hopefully quite soon afterwards, to bring the remaining characters back together. So maybe what we can do now is have a little bit of fun in trying to think about how this might play out and trying to predict what this next book could look like in terms of the chapters that we're going to get. So we know we've got 4 big battles to come, and 2 of those were meant to have been wrapped up by the end of A Dance with Dragons. So a couple of these battles, as well as a couple of other plot lines, are relatively cut off from events happening elsewhere in the novel. And just like in A Feast for Crows, a lot of these are bound by location. So if there is going to be a novel that comes out before the Winds of Winter, I think it makes a lot of sense that it either concentrates on or excludes some geographically specific areas. Just like A Feast for Crows concentrated on Dorne, the Iron Islands, and the Riverlands, and it excluded the North and Essos. So I think this as yet unnamed 6th novel that will come out before the Winds of Winter, I predict, will look something like this. So I think you will have POVs from Bran, Samwell, Areo-Hotah, Arianne, John Connington, Aeron Damphair, Sansa, Victarion, Tyrion, Barristan, and Arya. So, my thinking is that, number 1, you get Meereen and the Battle of Fire out of the way. You also get to concentrate on the Stormlands, which is not really anywhere we've been in any great depth before. The Battle of Steel, which apparently we're going to see. And then what I think will be a march on King's Landing. And then you get the Battle of Blood and whatever happens in Old Town and onwards. In addition to this, you'll get chapters from Bran, Sansa, Arya, and Areo-Hotah, which are all in pretty cut-off locations. They're building towards something that doesn't really depend on events happening elsewhere. Now, of these characters, I think you will see the end of Aeron Damphair, Areo-Hotah, and Barristan. I think these are 3 characters that will have their story arcs pretty much concluded in one way or another, and you can write them off from the story because you've got other point of view characters there to kind of pick up where they leave off. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. I think I think everyone will predict that Aria Hotel will have maybe 1 or 2 chapters before he meets his end somehow. I think Barristan's being set up for quite a glorious death in Marine, which will be fitting. He will have served his purpose. He was brought on as a POV very late on just to see us through the battle. And then with Aeron Damphair, like, we might not even get another chapter from him. He could be dead already. And we just pick up with Sam in Old Town to see Euron's invasion. But I get the feeling that we're going to see something pretty weird happening on the Redwine Straits for Aeron's last chapter, where we do get to see fully what Euron is going to mean to this story. I've got 2 videos coming out on Euron very soon, and I kind of touch on this. And I also think that with a good few of those POV chapters, I think they're the ones that are kind of lagging behind in terms of where the story should have got to by the end of A Dance with Dragons. And what that then means is that when we start looking to what at least the first instalment of The Winds of Winter will look like, you've got chapters from Dany, Cersei, Jaime, Brienne, Theon, Asher, Melisandre, Davos, and, I'd imagine, eventually Jon. Now, to be honest, these are my favourite storylines in the whole of the series. For anyone who's familiar with my channel, I basically do deep dives into the Stark family and the Crypts of Winterfell and what the older way of Westeros means for the rest of the story and where it's heading. More than anything else, I want to see the conclusion to the Stannis storyline in the north, and essentially the reclaiming of Winterfell, and eventually Jon's rebirth and what he ends up looking like for the rest of the story. That's the one thing that I'd like to see before the novels from this series end. So as much as I'd like to have all of that stuff in the next installment, I do think it kind of makes sense to bring other storylines up to speed before we get there, because it's so important. And then later on, you'll get additions from Bran, Sam, Sansa, Tyrion, Arya, and potentially Jon Connington and Victarion if they haven't died. But yeah, that's when you can start really speculating about where the story's going to go and who's going to make it through to A Dream of Spring. What I'm getting to here is that what George R. R. Martin thinks he's doing now, which is fitting a big book into 1,500 manuscript pages, that is impossible for The Winds of Winter with 20-odd POV characters. But it is extremely possible with A Dream of Spring, which will have something closer to 15. And, you're back into a Storm of Swords territory in terms of POV characters and in terms of potential word count. I think A Dream of Spring would be a very similar book to A Storm of Swords, in that you've got all these big tentpole events happening, and you can take that time to tell those parts of the story in a way that you can't do now, where you've got so much plot to get to and so many characters kind of battling it out for word count. Right now, I think we're all a little bit scared about whether we're even going to see The Winds of Winter, and I'm very much in that camp. I think if you get a book out before that, which at least wraps up a few storylines or gets them to roughly where they need to be at the end of A Dance with Dragons, hopefully that puts George R. R. Martin where he needs to be to finish what is probably going to be the hardest book of the whole series. And yeah, hopefully that would come out relatively soon afterwards, like a few years or so. I don't want to spoil the Admiral Curd video for anyone, but I think I think ultimately the prediction for when we're going to get The Winds of Winter will be something like 2035. That sounds reasonable to me. I'm going to be an old person by that point, and I suppose a lot of you guys are as well. But that's where we're at, and that's how long it takes to tell this story. And you know, I've made peace with that. And I think the wider fandom should do too. It's so immature to hear these people talking as if they're owed something from this series when they're not. You know, we shouldn't be at a stage where we're trying to demand things from someone who's given us this world. You know, it's not the way you want to work. Certainly it's not the way that George R.R. Martin has ever worked. He was a relatively, even though he was certainly successful, he was a relatively anonymous author before this series really took off. And so he's used to just writing in seclusion and going about things in his own way. And, you know, now that A Game of Thrones became what it was, suddenly he's in a position that he's not been in before. And, you know, in the later years of his life, we're demanding that he finishes these extremely complex novels. I find that ridiculous. So hopefully this you know, it's a bit of fun, but it's also a potential roadmap forward to where we can get the story a little bit further down the line. And ultimately, I can say this as a part-time YouTube creator, but it's fun to speculate on all this stuff. In the meantime, it does look like we're getting more Duncan Egg novellas. Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic about how the rest of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms is going to come out. I can't wait for the Swan Sword. That's my favourite bit of George R.R. Martin writing ever, I think. Right up there with Dying of the Light. Yeah, you know, I'm trying to be a little bit positive after what was a pretty shocking article to read. But yeah, I wanted to share my thoughts on that. I'd love to know what you guys think. I would like to know if there's anyone watching this video who thinks differently from me and who potentially has a bit of a chip on their shoulder and who thinks that, you know, we're owed something. I'd be interested to know how you could kind of justify that in terms of what we think we're due as fans. But also, you know, writing as someone who does do these deep dives into the Westeros world, who sees almost unlimited depth to these things. I find George R.R. Martin to be an extremely well-read, extremely interesting person, and I don't like the idea of him being sat in front of a computer, sad and frustrated about his obligation to fans. That really bothers me. I'll leave it there for this video. It's a lot longer than what I thought it would be. So this is a different kind of video than I normally do. For anyone not familiar with my channel, please do look at my previous videos, in particular the one of the Crypts of Winterfell, which I'm quite proud of. Please do subscribe because there'll be a lot more coming this year. And if you do want to get in contact with me further, I am on this social media platform called Blue Sky, which is like Twitter, but a lot less horrible. And I'm going to be posting on there a little bit more, chatting a little bit more about the videos and the A Song of Ice and Fire world and what's happening with the channel. And I'd love to know your thoughts on anything that I've been talking about. I'd like to know what you'd like to see next. And yeah, until the next time, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.